It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have said goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up the mouth of the canyon, got out of their car, and started hiking just under the light of the stars since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be dark, and because it was getting to be quite late. He ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsing of the story, my friend's mom would say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail as he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial killer Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the one time that he felt the closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body, and for some reason just turn around and walk away. I used to be a Jehovah's Witness as a kid, that thing where they go around knocking on doors to preach to you. I was doing that with my mom and a few others. We walked up to this house with a slanted driveway with trees around each side. We knocked on the door and everything felt very normal. Except this time I got hit by something that I couldn't see or explain. My ears started ringing and buzzing like crazy. It felt like I had been hit on the head, but like I said, I couldn't explain it and I still can't. My body was screaming at me to leave. While we were standing there, the man listened to my mom's intro, then said he was interested in hearing more, and invited us in. When we got inside, everything that I had felt earlier while we were standing on his porch had gotten much stronger. The air felt like it got dense to keep me from moving. My mom looked at me and she said I looked off, pale and distant. She told him that I seemed to be ill and that we should just leave. As soon as we stepped onto the ground in view of the car, I felt completely fine. My mom decided to take me home anyway. We lived 2 blocks away, luckily. A few days later, we read in the paper about how that same guy was arrested for rape and murder of a few women. I think one of them was as young as 16, which is terrifying to think about. So back in the 80s, my mom lived in a bedsit, which is basically shared accommodation, just in case you don't know, and had some guy knock on the door around 11 p.m. All the other young women she lived with had went out earlier in the evening to go drinking, but my mom stayed back due to work the next day. My mom, being the wise person she is, didn't open the door to him, but opted to shout out the window asking who it was. Some dude just stood there with a baseball cap on, briefcase in his hand, and insisted he had a business meeting with the business below the bedsit. Throughout the conversation, he refused to look directly up at her and didn't want to leave. My mom thought this was strange, especially at 11 p.m. at night, so she effectively told him to go away and contact whoever he was supposed to be meeting. She reported this incident to police. Many years later, my mom found out that it was actually the bedsit killer, and she could have potentially been his next victim that night. She got a call back in 2021 from detectives saying that they remanded a man on suspicion of the rapes and killings of 2 women back in the 80s through DNA, and they highly suspected he was the man on the doorstep that night from descriptions in her report, and they wanted to use this as evidence in court. My mom lived 1 road over from one of the victims who coincidentally shared the same name as her and looked very similar. We got invited to the sentencing at court and managed to see him on the dock, and my mom thought it was definitely the man from that night. He got a whole life sentence for the murders and other crimes. I won't go into it, but when they arrested him for the murders and searched his property back in 2021, they unveiled evidence that he'd been abusing bodies in a mortuary in the hospital he worked at for years.